lot of great stuff right now playing on the radio, or maybe a streaming platform or something. I don't know. I don't know what's around the corner, but one thing I can say, yeah, but who did it first? So hello and welcome to the very first episode of Yeah, but Who Did It First? It's a program where we examine current popular music trends and discover their origins. And for our first one, I thought we'd talk about what's on the radio. The foundation of all bands, artists, pop groups, all of that usually starts with someone in a bedroom or a basement somewhere with a piano or a guitar, learning how to play it, learning how to write, learning how to sing. And these people are the singer songwriters. One of the most famous guys around today is Ed Sheeran. He's released his newest album this year, which debuted at number 1 on the Billboard charts, which means he is a sales and download titan in the music industry. He's got this boyish charm, and he's got sincere songs and silly songs, catchy hooks, and it's earned him a large and loyal following around the world. He has 7 number 1 singles. He's got multiple songs in the top 10. He's acted and had songs in movies, and we don't want to take away any of those accomplishments or diminish his role and his value to his legions of fans. But honestly, he's not the first singer songwriter to be famous. And in fact, there's so many right now, it's actually a testament to his songwriting and performing skills that he's been around for more than a year or two. But, again, this fascination with singer songwriters, people with guitars, it's not anything new. Sometimes it comes from people in bands. We've had Chris Cornell come from Soundgarden. We've had Sting come from The Police. We've also had small groups break away. So Paul Simon, who's just finishing up his professional career, he's on a farewell tour, comes from Simon and Garfunkel, just a duo. Eric Clapton, same sort of thing, finishing up his last album, was from a three-piece band called Cream. But of course, then we have the big one, the Beatles, where literally all 4 members had very successful solo careers. But that doesn't mean that you had to be in a band. I mean, Ed Sheeran is a solo artist. He has a band, but he's primarily a solo person, just like someone like Justin Bieber or Taylor Swift. They're more recent. John Mayer, still performing today, but comes from the early 2000s. Matt Nathanson, his quirky styles are still floating around. Dave Matthews, very popular in the 90s. He's making a comeback now. Bruce Springsteen from the 70s and primarily in the 80s starts to bridge the gap between pop music and folk, just like James Taylor, getting a little bit more on the folky side there. And then we have the Grand Master, Bob Dylan. And then his inspirations, Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie. And then, oh, oh my, it's me. But I'm not famous. And I guess that is sort of the point. For every one famous person, there are literally like 1,000 people who aren't popular. Now, some of them never had the ambition to be in the spotlight or famous in the first place. Some people get sidetracked by their lives. And the big thing, I think, is these people just don't happen to be in the right place in the right time. And it's exceedingly rare to find someone who captures the essence of the popular times and can turn it into music that an entire generation can call their own. And it's tricky because music always changes. And especially since the 1980s, the concept of what is pop music has really changed. It started with MTV. This was a television channel that showed music on TV, music television, and it premiered in 1981. And this is the first time that the public could really see their performers. Before, if you wanted to actually see what you heard, you had to find a band on tour, go to a concert, and be in the front row. But on MTV, you could see it all. And that changed. That changed things. People wanted to look cool as well as sound cool. And this first Video Killed the Radio Star, it was the first thing on MTV, and they knew it. They all knew that the world was about to change, and it did drastically. Producers and record execs would start looking for their talent based on looks rather than on music in order to find the next popular thing. They're just trying to make money. And that Video Killed the Radio Star is really true. Would someone like Bob Dylan, who doesn't have the traditional looks of, say, Justin Bieber or Justin Timberlake or Elvis, would he be popular in the MTV era? Luckily, he was famous before then, but it changed things. You might have been a 10 out of 10 on vocals and a 7 out of 10 or a 5 out of 10 on looks, and you could still be famous. But once MTV happened, you had to be at least as good looking. Until the 1990s, that is, when autotune came about. And now, in the 90s, it became purely eye candy. So many people in the 1990s started using autotune that maybe you couldn't sing at all, but you were attractive enough to be on TV. They would just use autotune to fix it. Nowadays, in the 2000s, technology has developed so much that everybody has some sort of music thing right at their fingertips, and that's great. It's wonderful to give so many people access to things. But if people are composing music that are completely uneducated about music, about how to write it, or even know the history of the stuff that they claim to like, they're writing music that becomes boring and pedantic and simple, and it makes everybody sort of stuck in a rut. Eventually, new visionaries are going to come along and say, hey, this stuff is boring, and they're going to change it. But at that point, when they change it, they're going to be reinventing the wheel, doing the stuff that other people have already done. And that's why it's so important to look back through time and find out the good singer songwriters and see what they did. Because those people that were there before the 1980s, they could sing and write at an unparalleled level. They could play, write, sing. They were the pure triple threat. And it didn't matter what they looked like, if there was auto tune, if there were smart music or smartphone pianos or YouTube subscribers or Twitter followers or anything. They just could play and sing. They didn't even need dancers on stage. They didn't need moves like Jagger because they were Mick Jagger. They were the people back then that we are emulating now. And I guess the big hunt is finding the next original person now that people are going to be copying in the future. But it all came from this mystique of the singer-songwriter. So this guy here, Ed Sheeran, yeah, he's got a lot of things going for him. A lot of hits. And he's a fine singer, he's a great writer, good performer. But who did it first? Now, if you're a fan of Ed Sheeran, you might know that he has credited lots of different people, but recently, a person that has been on his radar is a guy named Bruce Springsteen, aka The Boss. He gets to start in the 70s, doesn't become really popular until the 80s, and he's from New Jersey, a blue collar working community guy who grew up listening to folk music where they would tell stories through their songs about people working to get by. And so that's what he does. He starts as a folk singer, he adds a high energy band, so it makes for a great performance. But what he's doing, he's singing about the American dream. Songs like Born to Run or Atlantic City are about songs where, to use his words, we got to get out while we're young and make a better life for themselves. Born in the USA, talking about the American dream, what it means to be an American. And this helps to build up a loyal following, and it helps people to associate with him and to understand where he's coming from because so many people have been in that situation before. Now, granted, over the years, he's gotten rich and famous, and so doesn't have to sing about the hardworking guy anymore, but he still does. And that helps to maintain that loyalty. And on top of it, he's actually gotten a lot into politics, where he is trying to take the money and put the money where his mouth is and help people out. Now, this is not a new idea, luckily. It comes from people before him. The idea of a folk singer trying to help people out. And one of his big inspirations was a guy named Bob Dylan. He was born Robert Zimmerman in Minnesota. However, after he moves to New York City and he meets the Beatniks, he changes his name and he wants to do something else. The Beatniks were intellectual poets centered in Greenwich Village, and they were sort of the first rappers. They started using interesting terminologies, and they would rap about the times and perform their poetry and rhymes in time. And Dylan loved it. He got along with it really well, and he started writing music with some of his favorite poets. And then he started looking at the news and started writing his own poems about the news and writing his own songs, and people loved it. The radio was there, started broadcasting everything he was singing, and what he was singing were songs about the past, songs from the past, but more importantly, songs about the present, and they would shape things to come. He wrote songs like Blowin' in the Wind and The Times They Are Changin', sort of about society and about how we treat one another, and those songs became instant classics, and they were off his first two records in the early 1960s. He wasted no time making his imprint on music. A song like Masters of War, also from the same time, a scathing rebuke of the American government and how they treated people in Korea and in Vietnam during war times. The amazing thing about all of this stuff with Bob Dylan, he affected so many people. He was the voice of their generation, and he admits that he has no idea how he did it. He said he was in the right place in the right time with the right passions, and it was just almost like magic. But what he will admit is that it would not have happened had he not known the previous generation of folk singers. Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger were from the early 1900s, not the mid 1900s, and they were sort of the father and grandfather of folk music in America. Dylan actually met Woody Guthrie, and if it weren't for that meeting, he never would have even tried to make ends meet as a singer in Greenwich Village. Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger both were incredibly important people, and we could talk at length about them. But things were a little different before them. Before the 1910s, things were a bit different. The guitar, what we think of now as the quintessential rock and roll instrument or the singer-songwriter instrument, was not very popular before 1940s. And the reason for that is that they were very quiet and you couldn't play them with other instruments until Les Paul and Leo Fender came along and electrified them. This made them much more popular. But before that, the big instrument for everybody was the piano. That leads us to Irving Berlin. He was an American but born in Russia, so he was naturalized here after he moved to New York City with his parents, and he worked in New York City on a street called Tin Pan Alley. Basically, it was just a street for music publishers and composers to have warehouses and studios where they would just sit almost factory style and compose music and just churn out all this music. The idea was that they would be able to print sheet music and sell it. They'd be able to write songs for people to sing on the radio, like Frank Sinatra, like Dean Martin, and they would be able to start making more musicals in the 1930s and eventually the 40s and 50s. A lot of the musicals came from New York City in Tin Pan Alley. Now it has since moved to Los Angeles, but back in the day, it was here in New York. And Irving Berlin was sort of the king of Tin Pan Alley. He wrote over 1,200 songs, had 25 number one hits. Songs like Alexander's Ragtime Band, Putting on the Ritz, Anything You Can Do, I Can Do Better, all come from musicals that are still performed today, and these songs are famous. You'll recognize them when you hear them. They get turned into memes. He also wrote God Bless America, something that everyone knows and plays, and he used to actually go on tour and sing this. But it was not a new idea. What he was doing was simply taking the American song tradition that was started by Stephen Foster. Stephen Foster was alive in the mid 1800s, so actually before the Civil War, and only about 70 years after America has become a country. And up until then, there were no full time composers. Stephen Foster was the first one. He composes over 200 songs and is easily the most famous songwriter of the 1800s here in America. He was born in Pennsylvania in the north. He lived in Cincinnati, literally directly across the river from the south, and he became well acquainted with both northerners and southerners. And his music reflects that. He genuinely admired the African American community, essentially the slaves. He liked their culture, he loved their music, and he wanted to help them. He incorporated the styles of their culture and of their diction, the way they spoke, the way they sang, the type of music that they played, and he incorporated it into his music. So now a lot of white people were introduced to black slave music. He was troubled by the way that slaves were treated, and songs like Old Kentucky Home and Hard Times Come Again No More were written not from Stephen Foster's point of view, but from a slave's point of view. So, a very interesting man, Stephen Foster, and he was very well known and very well famous. but he got some of his ideas from someone who came before him. Franz Schubert was a German composer in the early 1800s, and now we have to cross over the Atlantic. There were no composers of merit before Stephen Foster, so to find more singer-songwriters, we have to go backwards in time into Europe. So we go to Germany. Franz Schubert's only 31, but writes over 600 songs plus 900 other things, chamber music, symphonies, just an incredibly prolific composer of all sorts of things. He has a very famous standalone song called Der Erlkönig, which is sort of a creepy, amazing thing that gets listened to a lot at Halloween time. And Schubert was actually very far ahead of his time. If we think of Ed Sheeran, his most recent album went to number one. That album has multiple songs on it, 10, 12 songs on every album. People back in the classical time period did not write that way. If they wrote a song, they wrote one of them. If they wrote an opera, that was the only place we had more than one song collected. Schubert would write things called song cycles. Essentially, they were records before there were records. So Winterreise and Die Schöne Märchen, song cycles, telling stories through many different songs. So Schubert's actually sort of living in the future. He would do well now making records. He also wrote religious music, Ave Maria, a very famous piece that's actually set over top of a piece of music written by J.S. Bach. Now, Franz Schubert, his songs were very interesting because the people of his time would try and write beautiful melodies and then sort of mash words into that melody. Schubert did the opposite. He wrote the lyrics or found a poem first and then matched the melody up to those. So the melodies are more syllabic, which usually does not make for a very beautiful melody, but Schubert had the talent to do it. So he was a double threat of writing beautiful melodies and getting his idea across. He was good at both. It was this songwriting model that people later used, like Stephen Foster. Irving Berlin copied Stephen Foster, who was really just copying Franz Schubert. And Franz Schubert was copying someone who actually had to use a different instrument altogether. So, like we had with guitars and pianos, before pianos, things were a little bit different. The piano was not invented until 1700. Before that, it was the harpsichord. It was not loud, like the piano, not portable. There was no sustain. You hit the key on the harpsichord, you'd pluck the note, note would be done. So, what people used for more sustain, not for portability, was the organ. And there you see the giant pipes. There you see the multiple keyboards, including the one for the feet, a foot keyboard, a key foot, a foot board. Not sure what exactly you call it, but it's amazing. If you've ever seen an organist play, it's like they're tap dancing while they are playing the piano on two different levels. Absolutely amazing. Most organs were found in churches simply because that's the only place big enough to hold them. So if you have a composer like J.S. Bach who works in churches, you're going to use the organ a lot. Now, Bach didn't write traditional songs like Schubert or Ed Sheeran, for that matter. He wrote lots of hymns. So if you picture a song with a guitar accompaniment, a hymn is like a melody with a choir accompaniment. So we have soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. Hymns are 99% of the time of a religious nature, but Bach wrote lots of them. He wrote hymns, he wrote cantatas, and they are still performed today. Sleepers Awake and Sheep May Safely Graze. You can find these in every Protestant hymnal. Still popular, still famous. So while not a traditional song, if you're a master like Bach is, then you certainly deserve credit. People who did write more like traditional songs that we think of did still exist before Bach's time. I mean, we're already back in the 1700s. And before that, in the 1600s, there was Henry Purcell. He was an English composer. He wrote 8 operas, over 100 hymns, and 200 songs. Doesn't seem like a lot, but we get to that in a minute. He was heavily involved with theater, and that's where he gets the operas. And this is where he gets a great sense of drama. He would use this drama in his music by using things called suspensions. If we have a chord progression, maybe going from 5 to 1, we know that in the fifth chord, in the dominant chord, there's a 7th scale degree that goes back home. Well, what he might do is go 5 to 1, but not make that 7th note go home yet. So he would delay that. He would suspend the resolution of that chord, causing tension, and then slam it home. Or he might do the opposite. He might have the seventh note go to the final chord early before everything else in anticipation. He was very dramatic. Lots of people liked it, including kings and queens and dukes and earls, and he was very famous among the very rich and the very powerful and the very wealthy. The sad part is he died young. So while only 100 hymns, 200 songs, 8 operas, that's a lot for being only 35 or 36. And he has funny things like Strike the Viol. He has sort of mystical things like Fairest Isle, talking about King Arthur and Camelot. He has many famous operas. Of those 8, The Fairy Queen is famous. Dido and Aeneas is very famous. Generally a happy guy, lots of fun stuff. But he could write a sad song here or there. And the reason for that is because the generation before him were locked in this concept of melancholia or sadness, which means that he was inspired by people that came before him. But before we get there, we have to talk instruments again. In the late 1600s, instruments are still being developed, and many of the instruments that we know today were developed after this. So before this, our instrumental choices are much different than what we get now. There are still woodwinds, but instead of oboes and saxophones and flutes, we get recorders and crumhorns. There's brass, but it's only for church use and there's no valves. We have string instruments, but not like the violin. We have the viol and the lute. So the bass comes from the viol family, but the lute looks kind of familiar. It kind of looks like an oddly shaped guitar, and it is an early relative of the guitar. It has strings and frets just like that, but it's softer and it's tuned a little different. And all of that makes it really good for use with one or two other instruments, maybe a cello type thing, and of course, the human voice. And this is where we sort of have come full circle. We've gone from guitar to piano to organ. Now we have this lute, and that's where we find John Dowland. John Dowland is another English composer, lived around the same time as Queen Elizabeth I and William Shakespeare. So we're talking the Renaissance, well before America is a country. And at this time, John Dowland is literally world famous. And this takes some talent at this time. This is before Twitter, this is before YouTube, this was before TV, before radio, it's even before electricity. So in order to be world famous, you literally have to get in your horse-drawn carriage and get there somehow. And that's what John Dowland did. He was world famous. He was that good. That should tell you something. But even still, he didn't make it into the job he wanted. He wanted to be Queen Elizabeth's personal lutenist. He blames religion. Queen Elizabeth said, I don't want you, but they would probably love you in Denmark. And she was right. He went to Denmark. He was exceptionally famous there. The king loved him. In fact, John Dowland was one of the highest paid people in all of Denmark while he was alive. But he did return to England often to publish his songs, of which he wrote over 120, and a lot of them were sad. Sad, yet really beautiful. Very heart wrenching lyrics, very beautiful melodies, very interesting lute parts that would oftentimes mirror what's going on in the music. So there was tone colors and word colors that we did not have before John Dowland. But we see a lot of this melancholia, sort of like early emo. In darkness, let me dwell. Come again, heavy sleep, flow my tears. There is a bit of humor there as well. The lowest trees have tops. A lot of his music is really wonderful. A lot of his music is performed in a very strange way to our ears now. That's sung in falsetto, but that's a whole different story because it wasn't falsetto. They were eunuchs. Snip, snip. We'll talk about it some other time. The thing with John Dallin, though, is that he got some of his ideas from stuff that happened before him. So now we're here at 1580, and if we're still going back, who did do this stuff first? It was the troubadours. The troubadours are from 1000 to 1300, so we're talking now medieval times, the Dark Ages. And troubadours are mainly French lyric poets, not singer-songwriters, no, no, singer poets that would often travel the countryside from town to town. This is where we get the concept of traveling minstrels, although if they were offered a job at a court or in a town, they would probably keep it. Think of the rock bands like Queen now, or Elton John, or Celine Dion, who are offered tenures in Las Vegas. Sure, if you're going to pay me to sing and stay in one place, I'll do that. So these troubadours would do that. They're not always traveling minstrels, but it is a thing that happened. The neat thing about troubadours is that they were often granted freedoms that other people didn't have in this time period. Not everybody could read and write, and the church was very particular about what people could say. But these troubadours were very interesting. They would travel with the Crusaders from Europe to the Middle East. And as they would do this, they would travel and gather news. So as they would go from Europe to the Middle East, they would take news to the Middle East. And on the way back, they would take news of the Crusades. And because of this, they were allowed to speak their mind freely. It would lift the spirits of the Crusaders, it would pass news along, and it would be a great thing for all people involved. Now, the music itself, you see it there on the upper right, looks a little different than we expect to see today. It's just a single line. Yeah, there are bunches of lines there, but it's just one instrument to play it. If it's just one instrument doing one thing, it's called monophonic, one sound. And if you look there with one instrument doing one thing, it's sort of a small piece of paper. And of this time period, only 264 pieces of music total remain. They estimate that it's over 2,000 songs that were known, over 400 troubadours that were known, but only 264 pieces of music that remain. And of those, none of them have specific accompaniment. This means that the emphasis was going to be on lyrics and on melody. Now, of course, we can presume that there were people wandering around as minstrels with lutes singing their songs of news and things like that, but we don't know for sure. That's why the lyrics and the melody were so important. Now, sometimes, of course, you'd have a really important story, so maybe the melody wouldn't be quite as interesting, or maybe it's just a song about love, so you have a beautiful melody, not an interesting story. This happens today, it happened back then, it's nothing new. But either way, the troubadours considered their music and their lyrics, their poems, as one and the same. They were equally important. You could not have one without the other. So they would sing about things that they cared about: chivalry, courtly love, unrequited love. They would use that freedom of speech to criticize society and point out injustices, criticize the government, which isn't done in some countries today. Now, they couldn't get away with poking fun at the clergy or the church, but they had free reign for commentary on everything else. Therefore, some of them were funny, some of them were vulgar, just like we had today. And just like today, we have different styles in different countries. Troubadour is a French term. So the people that were troubadours in Spain and Italy and Germany, they weren't called that. They had their own names. But the idea was the same. You'd have some people who would be writing their own words using someone else's melody, or writing their own melody using somebody else's poems, or else you would just take a new poem or a new idea and then use some music that people already knew and sort of just change it around like Weird Al Yankovic does today. But if you're doing that, that means that there must have been other music beforehand. So, who was around before the troubadours? The answer may surprise you. It's monks. That's right. Catholic monks were the first people in Western culture in Europe to notate music. They needed to write down what they were singing in church. This is a great idea if you want your congregation to remember it. Guido de Arezzo is an Italian monk who, around the year 1000, developed what we now use as the current music notation. Of course, it's evolved and it looks a little different and it's been altered since then. We have different clefs, but it's that same concept. What he did was he took a song that all of the monks knew all around Italy, and he started naming the notes based on the first 6 notes of that song, and he called them do, re, mi, fa, sol, la. Of course, with these alterations, we added a T do at the end of that. But this is where all of this music comes from. And it's really important because then you're able to take this music that you're singing, copy it down, and transport it to a different church. Then those monks learn it and teach it to their congregation. And then over time, the troubadours would take some of those songs, those familiar melodies, and change the words, maybe pass along some news or to start poking fun at the government or realize society has some issue it needs to work out. And then John Dallin takes those ideas about songs and starts incorporating them into the lute songs, which get published. And he starts adding ideas for the lutenist to maybe have an improvisational time. So instead of a guitar solo, maybe you have a lute solo. And then over time, those song styles begin to develop with a choir or with an organ or maybe with a piano over time. And then people continue to use that piano to write songs and tell stories about the plight of others or of their own emotions or of rising tensions among people, allowing the public to have a social discourse. And then it travels over to America, and this concept of pop music, of popular culture, continues on with Tin Pan Alley in New York City. And then composers will continue to use this written music and live music as a vehicle for news and social awareness and pure entertainment. Also, that Ed Sheeran can sing for you today in 2019. So, who did it first? 1,000 years in the making of these singer songwriters. We go back to the monks who take us through the troubadours and John Dowland, Henry Purcell and Bach. Franz Schubert starts to combine all these things. Stephen Foster makes it American. Irving Berlin makes it popular. Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie start with the folk revolution. Bob Dylan leads to Bruce Springsteen, who inspires Ed Sheeran. And who knows where we're going to go from here. But until we find out, happy listening.